Chapter 29 Fiscal Federalism and Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations in Nigeria. Contents: 1. Purpose. 2. Introduction. 3. Concept of Fiscal Federalism. 4. Elements of Fiscal Federalism. 5. Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations in Nigeria. 6. Chapter Review. 7. Worked examples. Fiscal Federalism and Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations in Nigeria. Purpose. After studying this chapter, readers should be able to A. Define fiscal federalism in its different forms. B. Identify and discuss the elements of fiscal federalism. C. Explain the basis for fiscal federalism and fiscal decentralization. D. Describe and characterize intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. And E. Discuss the problems of intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. Introduction. Many countries, including Nigeria, can be considered to be federations in the practical sense that significant fiscal function, that is, revenue generation and incurring of expenditure, are undertaken by different levels of government or subnational units of government. Such federal economies have developed elaborate forms of fiscal arrangements between the federal, that is the central, and other state and local levels of government, which jointly determine the way in which tax bases are allocated and shared among the various levels of government, as well as how funds are to be transferred from one level to another. Such arrangements have been giving rise to the economics of fiscal federalism. This chapter, therefore, discusses fiscal federalism and intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. The chapter is organized into two major parts. The first reviews the general theory of fiscal federalism, while the second discusses and characterizes the nature of intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. Concept of fiscal federalism. Basically, fiscal federalism is a subfield of public finance that addresses the vertical structure of the public sector. It is the general normative framework for assignment of functions to the different levels of government and appropriate fiscal instruments for carrying out these functions. However, there are two related concepts of fiscal federalism, namely political and administrative federalism. A. Political federalism describes the constitutional division of powers between tiers of government, each of which is supposed to be coordinate and independent. B. Administrative federalism, in contrast, is more a matter of administrative fiat and involves the delegation of functions to subnational levels of government. This is in general based on guidelines and controls created by higher levels of government, e.g., federal or state, so that the administrative delegation lacks the autonomy associated with the decentralization of powers. Since administrative delegation is common in most political systems, be it federal or not, e.g., delegation to local governments, the focus is often more on political federalism. Elements of fiscal federalism. The principal defining elements of fiscal federalism include A. The rationale for adopting a federal structure in a country. B. Objectives of fiscal relations. C. Rules for the assignment of functions and sources of income to different tiers of government, that is, the expenditure assignment arrangement. D. The efficiency of free migration from one jurisdiction to another. E. The role of intergovernment resource transfers and their most desirable forms, that is, revenue allocation. And F. Principles for intergovernmental transfers. The rationale for adopting a federal structure in a country. The adoption of a federal structure and/or fiscal federalism is usually underlined by fundamental objectives. This underlying objective defines the nature of the federal structure or fiscal federalism in federating countries. The survey of older or advanced federations across the globe, for example, revealed the following main objectives. A. Resolution of conflicts, Switzerland. B. Strengthen an efficient system, USA. C. Maintain a relatively weak state, Germany. And D. To take account of current history, Australia. Objectives of fiscal relations. An ideal system of fiscal relations among units in a federation would: A. Ensure correspondence between subnational expenditure responsibilities and their financial resources, including transfers from the central government, so that functions assigned to subnational governments can be effectively carried out. B. Increasing the autonomy of subnational governments by incorporating incentives for them to mobilize revenues of their own. C. Ensure that macroeconomic management policies of the central government are not undermined or compromised. D. Give expenditure discretion to subnational governments in appropriate areas in order to increase the efficiency of public spending and improve the accountability of subnational officials to their constituents in the provision of subnational services. E. Incorporate intergovernmental transfers that are administratively simple, transparent, and based on objective, stable, non-negotiated criteria. F. Minimize administrative costs and thereby economize on scarce administrative resource. G. Provide equalization payments to offset differences in fiscal capacity among states and among local governments, so as to ensure that poorer subnational governments can offer sufficient amount of key public services. H. Incorporate mechanisms to support public infrastructure development and its appropriate financing. I. Support the emergence of a governmental rule that is consistent with market-oriented reform. And J. Be consistent with nationally agreed income distribution goals. It is important to note that balancing objectives such as efficiency, revenue adequacy, and subnational governments and autonomy may be difficult. For instance, too generous support for subnational governments may discourage their own revenue efforts and autonomy, undercut central stabilization policy. Also, different countries attach different priorities to each of these objectives, and the priorities may change over time. And since not all these objectives can be achieved simultaneously, therefore, choices need to be made. The expenditure assignment function. Expenditure assignment deals with the allocation of spending powers and responsibilities to different levels of government, especially with respect to the provision and delivery of public goods and services. For various reasons, such as executive capacity, avoidance of unnecessary duplication, locational advantage like proximity to customers, economies of scale, etc. The central government should engage in certain forms of expenditures and activities, while lower levels of government should engage in others. The general guidelines upon which this expenditure assignment is based are A. Efficient provision of public services. By using the jurisdiction that controls the minimum geographical area that would bear the cost and benefits of the provision of such services. B. Equitable provision of public services. Through equal treatment of all citizens, irrespective of place of residence or employment, horizontal equity. This can avoid wasteful tax and expenditure competition among jurisdictions. Thus, effective redistribution programs are best handled nationally in pursuit of equity, but the participation of subnational governments in implementing specific programs is essential where such programs can be tailored to the peculiar circumstances of individual jurisdictions. C. Preservation of a single internal common market. When subnational governments try to attract labor, capital, and technology, they may erect local incentives that become barriers to the free flow of goods and inputs across governmental jurisdictions. Thus, the decentralization of government regulatory functions may create the possibility of disharmonious economic relations among levels of government and disrupt national economic and social integration. Hence, the regulation of trade and investment is best assigned to the central government. D. Economic stabilization. It is difficult for a subnational government to implement successful stabilization policy because the openness of its economy and the nature of stabilization policy, like monetary and exchange rate policies, that require coordination by a central bank. For similar reasons, decentralized fiscal policy needs feasibility through the structuring of tax assignment and fiscal policy coordination, and through regular meetings of officials of central and subnational governments. E. Efficient provision of quasi-public goods. Technically, services like health, education, social welfare, and social insurance are private goods, but they are provided by the public sector on equity grounds. When they are provided by the central government, this may be in order to satisfy minimum standards across jurisdiction. Centralization versus decentralization in fiscal federalism. The foregoing guidelines on expenditure and tax assignment set the basis for centralization and decentralization and their appropriateness generally and in particular instances. The cases for centralization in fiscal federalism hinge on the following considerations. A. Economies of scale. These are mostly in public utilities like water, electricity, sewage, etc. that requires servicing large areas and are natural monopolies. B. Spatial externalities. These arise when the benefit and or cost of public services fall on non-residents. In such cases, subnational governments are likely to undersupply such services, but where the costs are not fully internalized, there may be harmful overprovision. Examples of such services are defense, foreign affairs, and national transport networks, which are best provided by the central government. C. Compliance and administrative costs also tend to be lower when some public services are provided centrally. National regulatory services are of this nature, e.g., customs, examinations, postal services, etc. Conversely, decentralization is preferred in some expenditure activities for the following reasons. A. Differences in local needs and taste. These are best met through the subnational provision of public services. Central provision in such cases may lead to waste and under-provision, e.g. in education, health, housing, etc. B. Responsiveness to local issues. This occurs where decision-making over the provision of public services is close to the target population to be served. It also fosters grassroots participation, greater fiscal responsibility, accountability, and efficiency. C. Elimination of multiple layers of jurisdiction. This makes for more effective control and supervision of public services. D. Interjurisdictional competition and innovation. These tend to be fostered when more than one tier of government are involved in the provision of public services. This argument is an extension of the provision of public services. This argument is an extension of the competitive model in microeconomics and international free trade. At the theoretical level, it is generally agreed that the central government will be in a better position to perform the distribution and stabilization functions, as well as provide national public goods. This is because all of these functions would be inefficiently performed at the lower government levels for two interrelated reasons. The first is the difficulty in appropriating the full social benefits of the programs undertaken at that level. And second is the tendency towards free rider problem, the problem of wanting to consume a publicly provided goods and services without paying at all or sufficiently towards its provision. The efficiency of free migration from one jurisdiction to another. On identifying the possible advantages of the fiscal decentralization in the previous subsection, some assumptions were inherent which, being examined more thoroughly, are not in fact realistic. At least, if given a strict interpretation. Due to this, decentralization is not only an advantageous political instrument, but it also gives rise to problems or difficulties which, if not held with special caution, could turn decentralization into a political and economic disaster instead of resulting in all of the benefits previously mentioned. Within the scope of the state economic functions, allocation, distribution, and stabilization, the problems may be considered mainly in terms of the economic functions of allocation and distribution. Even when in decentralization matters, both these aspects seem to get mixed. Basically, the economic rationale for multi-level and multi-unit government is the existence of public goods and services with differing geographical spread of benefits and the need to allocate sufficient resources to their provision, given that the market or private sector fails in their provision. Because of this, the functions of government have come to be classified into the provision of national, regional, or state, and local public goods and services. This classification is hinged on the spatial limitation of the benefit incidence of the public goods and services, a conception that justifies the definition of public goods as non-excludable and or non-rivalry in consumption, subject to capacity constraint. Some Some social goods are national in that their benefits spread across the entire nation, e.g., national defense, macroeconomic stability, national pride, etc., while others are geographically limited, e.g., local fire service or street light. For the latter, clearly the benefits are limited to residents within the radius of the benefit circle in which the facility is located. Some other commodities have spillover effects such that a larger and/or central unit of authority is required to coordinate their supply, such as interstate and interlocal government roads and bridges. The foregoing interjurisdictional concerns in which the benefits of social goods and services provided by a level or unit of government transcend beyond the frontiers of that jurisdiction directly raises the issue of which economic functions are best performed by the central government and those by subnational governments. Generally, it is commonly agreed for efficiency and equity's sake that the central government would be in a better position to perform the distribution and stabilization functions, as well as provide national public goods for which there are substantial benefits spillovers. This is because these functions will be efficiently performed at the lower government tier or level for two interrelated reasons: difficulty in appropriating the full social benefits of the programs at that level, and the tendency towards free rider problem. On the other hand, lower level governments have comparative advantage in the provision of local public goods and services, especially those whose preferences vary geographically and for which there are no substantial economies of scale. Revenue allocation. Rising from the expenditure assignment function is the often thorny issue of revenue allocation. Perhaps the most important issue of fiscal federalism is the revenue allocation formula. The sharing of national revenue among the various styles of government, vertical revenue sharing, as well as the distribution of revenue among units of government of the same level, that is, horizontal revenue allocation. In determining how these resources are to be shared among the tiers of government, the popular practice is that these revenues be shared according to predetermined principles. In the extant public finance literature, the principles that are indicated to guide the implementation of intergovernmental fiscal relations include: A. The principle of diversity. The federal system must have the ability to accommodate a large variety of diversities. Hence, the fiscal system must provide scope for variety and differences to supply national, regional, and local public goods. B. The principle of equivalence. Based on the geographical incidence of different public goods, allocative efficiency requires the equalization of locational advantages arising from interjurisdictional differences with a combination of taxes and public goods and services. C. The principle of decentralized stabilization. This requires the use of fiscal instruments for achieving macroeconomic objectives of growth, stabilization, and full employment by residents of different geopolitical units. This requirement controls for what is often referred to as central city exploitation taxes. D. Minimum provision of essential goods and services. This ensures that fiscal federalism guarantees all citizens, irrespective of where they reside, the minimum provision of certain basic public goods and services. E. Principle of fiscal equalization. In order to ensure a minimum level of public goods and services, the same degree of fiscal equalization is required. This is called forth as a result of differences in resource endowment. F. The efficiency principle. This principle implies that efficiency must be applied in the allocation of resources. In addition, each level of government should maximize its internal revenue earnings at minimum tax efforts. G. The principle of derivation. The component units of a system should be able to control some of its own resources as they desire. H. The principle of locational neutrality. Interregional fiscal differences tend to influence location choices of individuals and firms based on different resource endowments, differences in tax capacity and effort. Some degree of locational interference seems to be an inevitable cause of intergovernmental fiscal relations. Thereof, policy should focus on minimizing distortions due to some interference. Hence, differential taxes which create locational distortions should be avoided as much as practicable. I. The principle of centralized redistribution. This principle states that the redistribution function of fiscal policy through progressive taxation and expenditure programs should be centralized at the federal level. This seems consistent with the principle of locational mentality. That is, if the redistributive function is decentralized, it can result in distortions in location decisions. However, it has been generally observed that the above principles are not mutually consistent and therefore difficult to apply simultaneously. Therefore, trade-offs are necessary in order to address these conflicts. Thus, quite often, the principles used are determined largely by the subjective interest of the ruling elite. This is so because no theory exists and can possibly exist showing which is the most appropriate principle to emphasize, when and how. A combination of a wide variety of changing factors, socio-economic and political, all uniquely combine to produce equity and efficiency, are usually the guiding principle. According to Kenneth Well, there is none and can be no final solution to the allocation of financial resources in the federal system. There can only be adjustments and reallocations in the light of changing conditions. What a federal system needs, therefore, is a machinery adequate to make these adjustments and to make them also in such a way that the financial independence of the central and lower level governments is preserved as far as possible. Thus, each federal system is a unique case of its own. Principles for intergovernmental transfers. Intergovernmental transfers of grants from higher to lower level governments are a critical part of fiscal arrangements in multi-level governments. It is usually classified into two broad categories as A. Matching or conditional grants. Require that the recipient uses the grant for a specific purpose, as well as provide a specific proportion of the total program cost to supplement the amount granted. B. Non-matching grants. This may be either conditional or unconditional. Do not require the recipient to provide a matching or supplementary amount. Such grants are usually spent where it may be necessary to subsidize programs considered to be of high priority by a higher level of government, but lower priority by a lower government. A number of principles have been identified that should guide intergovernmental transfers. These are: A. Fiscal imbalance or fiscal gap. This may be horizontal or vertical. The former refers to the mismatch between revenue raising and fiscal needs of government at the same level in a federation, while the latter refers to the mismatch between revenue means and expenditure needs at the various levels of government. B. Redistributive role of the public sector, which would sometimes require the central government to redress regional disparity. C. Preservation of internal common markets, which may require the federal government to ensure a common minimum level for public services, stabilization objectives, and D. Interjurisdictional spillovers, which may otherwise lead to under or overprovision of public services. Intergovernment fiscal relations in Nigeria. The nature and character of intergovernmental relations are discussed in this subsection of the chapter. To make for organized discussions, it is structured into three as follows. Profile of fiscal federalism in Nigeria. There has been a limited degree of fiscal decentralization in Nigeria since 1954, when the country adopted federalism. With federalism, regional and state governments were given functional responsibilities with separate and independent budgets. However, the revenues from regional or states remained grossly inadequate to meet their expenditure responsibilities. Therefore, states had to fall back on their share of federally collected revenues. But the federal government retained fiscal supremacy. The bulk of the revenue made available to the regional and state governments was on the basis of derivation between 1954 and 1974. The tendency towards equalization principle began. However, in 1975, when the government said that the existing revenue allocation formula accentuated disparities in the level of government among the states. Over time, more resources were made available to the states, but the bulk of the federally collected revenue continued to be retained by the federal government. Revenues accruing to the three levels of government consist of tax and non-tax financial flows, which are derived from internal and external sources. The internal sources are those revenue heads assigned to the three levels of government by the Constitution, while the external sources is made up of statutory revenue allocation, discretionary grants, and value-added tax VAT. Though there is clear and explicit division of rights to revenue sources among federal, state, and local governments. However, the major revenue heads in the country, including custom duties, mining rents and royalties, petroleum profit tax, and company income tax, all of which account for about 80% of total national recurrent revenues, fall under the legislative and administrative jurisdiction of the federal government, while the less productive and less buoyant sources are devolved to the fiscal jurisdiction of state and local governments. Until 1976, the position of local governments in the Nigerian federal setup was not clear, as they were merely decentralized units of the regional and state governments. The 1999 Constitution gave them recognition as the third tier of government with specific functions and sources of revenue. Consequently, they started to enjoy statutorily allocated revenues in 1981. Overview of revenue sharing in Nigeria. The evolution of revenue sharing, both vertical and horizontal, has tended to follow different phases of the evolution of fiscal federalism in the country. These phases of revenue allocation have been marked by various fiscal or revenue allocation commissions or committees or reviews, decrees and acts, and executive orders. Tables 29.1, 29.2, and 29.3 present the summary of revenue allocation reviews in Nigeria from 1946 to the present. Table 29.4 showed that vertical revenue sharing among the three tiers of government has followed shifting formulas, while Table 29.5 also showed that several principles, factors, or processes with weights assigned have been applied for horizontal revenue allocation among regions and states over time. These include derivation, input progress, needs, national interest, fiscal autonomy, United Nations national policy, comparable financial position for each regional government, minimum national standards, balanced development, equality of access to development opportunities, and absorptive capacity. Others are independent revenue generation and minimum tax effort, fiscal efficiency, minimum responsibility of government, population, social development factors, education and health, land area or land mass and terrain. The rationale adduced for each of these factors or processes has generally heated debate over time. For example, the protagonist of derivation principle argued that it would enable each region or state to align its expenditure with the available revenue. Simply put, it stresses fiscal discipline. On the other hand, its antagonist noted that it would make the rich regions or states richer and the poor regions poorer, thereby worsening the problem of uneven development. Problems of intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. There are critical issues and problems with decentralization of governments and intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria. These interrelated issues or problems are discussed under a number of subheadings as follows. A. Overdependence on oil revenue. The exploration of oil in Nigeria and its high-yielding revenue has continued to undermine the development of the hitherto buoyant agricultural sector and other viable sectors such as industry, mining, and human capital development. Consequently, oil revenue has become the major source on which the government critically depends on. This has with time led to the evolving of a leech syndrome among the component units of the Federation. Inevitably, it made the states dependent on the handouts from the Federation account. The leech nature of most of the states makes them an economic appendage of the central government and has eroded the autonomy of the federating units. This, in a way, established a master-servant relationship between the federal government and the component units. The current revenue sharing formula encourages laziness and idleness as states rely heavily on the federal allocation, a situation that makes most states, perhaps excluding Lagos, parasitic in nature, feeding voraciously on federation accounts. States have become drudge in initiatives, lacking in vision, and are development shy. B. Conflicts over revenue sharing formula. Revenue sharing among the component units of Nigerian Federation has, from the inception, been replete with agitations, controversies, and outright rejections due to the nature of the politics that is involved in it. The process of revenue sharing is inundated with conflicting criteria that were oftentimes rejected by majority of the states. Consequently, several attempts at revenue sharing, both vertically and horizontally, have been made. Yet no revenue sharing formula and set of principles has been considered acceptable among and within tiers of government at any point in time. A number of interrelated reasons have accounted for this. The major ones are 1. The allocation of revenue to the various levels of government after 1946 reflected a character of strong bargaining powers of the regions. That is, what went to a particular regional or state government depended on how well they could influence the bargaining process. 2. With the advent of military regimes, the pattern of revenue sharing formula appeared biased in favor of the region or state in control of the state power in Nigeria. Simply put, there was no doubt that a pattern of fiscal structure in which principles or criteria evolved previously are contested, and new principles or formula follow the same upward approach used by previous governments. 3. Consequently, the alteration of the principles so adopted became rather easy for the ruling government of the day. The paradox of the whole situation was that the attempt to find solutions to the intractable problem of revenue allocation went hand in hand with the subversion of the same process by the central government. 4. Lack of consensus on the criteria of distribution. 5. The absence of reliable socio-economic data. 6. The rapid rate of constitutional change and the extent to which revenue distribution is tied to perceptions of regional and ethnic dominance. And, due to all the foregoing, the determining factor in revenue allocation strongly revolved around political rather than economic criteria, thereby making the revenue allocation issue in Nigeria contentious and thorny. C. Centralizing tendency of fiscal relations. There are also the centralizing and hegemonic tendencies of the federal government. The radical change from agrarian economy to oil-driven economy further propelled centralism and hegemony of the central government over the states in Nigeria. Various military regimes, through series of military feuds and decrees, consolidated the hegemonic power of the central government. The federal government in Nigeria, in most cases, unilaterally spends or decides the modes and methods of spending. A case in point is the excess crude account which some states are challenging as unconstitutional. Furthermore, presently the federal government enjoys unlimited power and too many responsibilities in the exclusive legislative list. Moreover, fiscal laws seem to give more tax powers to the federal government than the lower tiers of government. The outcome of this concentration of spending and revenue generation powers in the center is decrease in internally generated revenue by the lower governments in a way that compels dependence on higher governments. D. Agitation for resource control. The historical facts of the use of the principle of derivation, emphasized earlier and de-emphasized later, have been a source of interregional or state conflict, rivalry, and antagonism. The major fallout of the downplay of the principle of derivation, which stipulates that the component units of a system should be able to control some of its own resources as they desire. In most of the oil-producing communities and states of the Niger Delta, there have been multifarious cases of kidnapping, vandalism of oil pipes and installations, desperations, and high-scale violence. Chapter review. This chapter has discussed the general theory of fiscal federalism, and against this background, it examined intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria via revenue sharing arrangements over time, which was observed to have been shaped by historical factors and others. A number of critical issues and problems with decentralization of government and intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria were identified and discussed. Worked examples. Questions. 1. What is fiscal federalism and why is it desirable? 2. Are the elements of fiscal federalism mutually exclusive or interdependent? 3. What is your understanding of the expenditure assignment function and what are the guiding principles? 4. Describe the nature and dimensions of the conflict in intergovernmental relations in Nigeria and suggest solutions. Suggested solutions. 1. Definition or meaning of fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism basically describes the general normative framework for assignment of functions to the different levels of government and appropriate fiscal instruments for carrying out these functions. There are two aspects to it, namely political and administrative. The political aspect describes the constitutional development, the division of powers between tiers of government, each of which is supposed to be coordinate and independent. While the administrative component, in contrast, is more a matter of administrative fiat and involves the delegation of functions to subnational levels of government based on guidelines and controls created by higher levels of government, e.g. federal or state. B. Argument of its desirability. The desirability of fiscal federalism lies in the fact, if properly implemented in a country, can foster economic growth and development. This is because it enhances the effectiveness and efficiency of the government in the provision of essential public goods and services, revenue sharing arrangements, and intergovernmental resource transfers, among others. For example, government will be effective and efficient if it undertakes only those functions which it can best perform. Indeed, some functions are best performed by the central government and others by the lower level government. The expenditure assignment function, a critical element of fiscal federalism, provides the general guidelines for the allocation of spending powers and responsibilities to different levels of government, especially with respect to the provision and delivery of public goods and services. Once the assignment function is done with, fiscal federalism provides clear guidance based on the socio-economic and political dynamics of a country on how revenue should be shared among tiers of government. Towards equalizing development across a country, fiscal federalism also provides guidance with respect to principles should guide intergovernmental transfers or grants. C. Identification of the elements of fiscal federalism. The elements of fiscal federalism are 1. The rationale for adopting a federal structure in a country. 2. Objectives of fiscal relations. 3. Rules for the assignment of functions and sources of income to different tiers of government, that is, the expenditure assignment arrangement. 4. The efficiency of free migration from one jurisdiction to another. 5. The role of intergovernment resource transfers and their most desirable forms, that is, revenue allocation. And 6. Principles for intergovernmental transfers. C. The argument of mutually exclusive or interdependent. The correct argument here is that the 6 elements of fiscal federalism are interdependent rather than being mutually exclusive. Every of the elements rely on the other, and collectively they determine the success or failure of fiscal federalism in a country. In other words, every of the elements cannot be in isolation of the other. All of them together define the nature and character of intergovernmental fiscal relations in a country. To start with, if the rationale for the adoption of a federal structure and or fiscal federalism is not clear or lacking, without clear fiscal relations or lacking the objectives of fiscal relations, will also not be clear, realistic, and achievable. Without clear fiscal relations objectives, expenditure assignment function would be largely ad hoc and not focused. This is because the underlying objectives of fiscal relations would guide the assignment of functions to the different levels of government. Even though theoretical guidance exists, however, what works best is informed by exigencies and experiences of a country. These exigencies and experiences are what the objectives of fiscal relations would capture or reflect. Once the expenditure assignment function is faulty, the allocation of revenue would also be faulty and create conflicts among and within tiers and levels of government. Likewise, the efficiency of migration from one jurisdiction to another, as well as intergovernmental transfers and grants, would also be affected. Summarily, each element of fiscal federalism is important and interdependent in making for a successful fiscal decentralization and intergovernmental relations in a country. 2a. Explanation of the assignment function. Expenditure assignment function is concerned with the allocation of spending powers and responsibilities to different levels of government, especially with respect to the provision and delivery of public goods and services. Theoretically, and for various rationalized reasons such as executive capacity, avoidance of unnecessary duplication, locational advantage like proximity to consumers, economies of scale, etc., the central government should engage in certain forms of expenditures and activities, while lower levels of government should engage in others. B. Discussion of the guiding principles. 3 marks each for any form mentioned and explained. The general set of principles which should guide expenditure assignment includes 1. Efficient provision of public services. By using the jurisdiction that controls the minimum geographical area that would bear the cost and benefits of the provision of such services. 2. Equitable provision of public services. Through equal treatment of all citizens, irrespective of place of residence or employment, horizontal equity. This can avoid wasteful tax and expenditure competition among jurisdictions. Thus, effective redistribution programs are best handled nationally in pursuit of equity, but the participation of sub-national governments in implementing specific programs is essential, where such programs can be tailored to the peculiar circumstances of individual jurisdictions. 3. Preservation of a single internal common market. Where subnational governments try to attract labor, capital, and technology, they may erode local incentives that become barriers to the free flows of goods and inputs across governmental jurisdictions. Thus, the centralization of government regulatory functions may create the possibility of disharmonious economic relations among levels of government and disrupt national economic and social integration. Hence, the regulation of trade and investment is best assigned to the central government. 4. Economic stabilization. It is difficult for a sub-national government to implement successful stabilization policy because of the openness of its economy and nature of stabilization policy, like monetary and exchange rate policies that require coordination by a central bank. For similar reasons, decentralized fiscal policy needs flexibility through the structuring of tax assignment and fiscal policy coordination, and through regular meetings of officials of central and subnational governments. 5. Efficient provision of quasi-public goods. Technically, services like health, education, social welfare, and social insurance are private goods, but they are provided by the public sector on equity grounds. When they are provided by the central government, this may be in order to satisfy minimum standards across jurisdictions. 4a. Description of the conflict. Intergovernmental fiscal relations in Nigeria has been riddled with conflicts over time. Several factors and/or issues are involved. However, the major and more obvious one is that of revenue sharing among the component units of Nigerian Federation. Indeed, from the inception, intergovernmental fiscal relations have been replete with agitations, controversies, and outright rejections due to the nature of the politics that is involved in it. The process of revenue sharing is inundated with conflicting criteria that were oftentimes rejected by majority of the states. Consequently, several attempts at revenue sharing, both vertical and horizontally, have been made. Yet, no revenue sharing formula and set of principles have been considered acceptable among and within tiers of government at any point in time. Between 1948 and today, 9 commissions, 6 military decrees, 1 act of the legislature, and 2 Supreme Court judgments have been resorted to in defining and modifying fiscal interrelationships among the component parts of the Federation. The inconclusiveness of the issue at the past Political Reform Conference and the recently concluded National Conference constitute latest attempts at engaging this issue. Thus, the clamor for an equitable revenue allocation remains a thorny issue as the contentious debate persists. The states continue to criticize the present lopsidedness in revenue sharing, insisting that the formula is disproportionately skewed in favor of the federal government, thus putting enormous resources at the center. The federal government contends that it has immense responsibilities of providing for education, health services, roads, energy, and national security, among others. Similarly, interstate conflict, rivalry, and antagonism over the current principles, especially the horizontal allocation, has heightened in recent times.
ensuing debates have therefore continued to emphasize the need to review the horizontal sharing indices, which tend to favor the well-established, that is, other states and local governments, to the disadvantage of their respective new counterparts with low per capita income. Other dimensions of the argument relate to the oil-rich versus non-oil-rich, which has made the oil-rich agitate for resource control, and the economically advantageous or disadvantaged states. B. Suggestions. To have an acceptable revenue sharing arrangement and minimize and/or avoid intergovernmental conflict in fiscal relations in the country requires that political considerations as basis for revenue allocation should be de-emphasized in favor of economic considerations and imperatives.